Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Dangers of Managing Risk in Spreadsheets, presented by ACL. The webinar today is designed for risk and audit professionals, so welcome. My name is Jonathan Ho. I'm a Marketing Programs Manager at ACL and will serve as your moderator for today. Before I introduce you to our esteemed speaker for today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this session will run for 60 minutes with time for Q&A at the very end. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A panel on your Zoom webinar console, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. If, for some reason, we don't have time to address all of your questions in today's live event, please be assured that we will follow up directly after the webinar. We are recording today's session, and everyone who registered will get an email with a link to the on-demand version and a copy of today's presentation slides within the next few days. I would now like to introduce you to our speaker for today's webinar. Dan Zitting is the Chief Product Officer at ACL. Dan is responsible for leading the product management, design, and user experience for ACL's industry-leading software products. With Dan's dedication to advancing the productivity to enhance the audit profession, he's been a 3-time winner of the CPA Practice Advisor magazine's 40 Under 40 and Reader's Choice Awards, and was recently named by Business in Vancouver as one of Vancouver's top 40 under 40. He is a certified public accountant, certified information systems auditor, certified information technology professional, holds a Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University, and a Master's of Science from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, Dan. The mic is yours.
All right. Well, quite the introduction. Thank you, Jonathan. So just to get things kicked off today, I want to talk about a few what are relatively simple questions that I've run into recently, or that I've run into with clients recently, that they struggled to answer, either perhaps because of they just didn't have the data to do it, or it was just too manually intensive an effort to do it and do it quickly. So super common questions like, across all of my risk management activities, which business unit leaders consistently assess risk lower across all process categories? Or across our different assessments and projects, how many times are we evaluating controls for network firewalls? Across applications or across business entities, how many issues did we see around terminated users? What was the total volume of requests or client requests that we made to a given contact in the business versus another? Or how many issues of those same contacts resolved in the past year? Or perhaps maybe even just looking internally within my own team or department, are certain of my staff members requiring many times the number of review notes and coaching comments to bring their work up to par than others? These, I'm sure, are common questions that we've all run into, but what I consistently found, at least in my previous experience and experience with clients, the challenge in answering these questions comes from the fact that it's just a manual process to pull together the data to answer these questions accurately, oftentimes the answer no longer being relevant by the time we accomplish that. And of course, that's the frustration that I want to talk about today. Fundamentally, there's so many of us that are still doing our primary risk management and audit activities and capturing our work along the way in documents and spreadsheets, which seems like an easy approach, but then why is it so frustrating to get those insights and answer simple questions like the ones I just shared on the previous slide? So take that to the extreme for a minute. Just as a ridiculous thought experiment, imagine if Amazon saved every sales transaction they did in thousands or millions of documents and spreadsheets. Obviously, they have many questions they answer about their data, but just doing so would cause questions, it would make it difficult to answer. What are the popular items? What should we recommend to shoppers next? All of these sorts of things. While it's ridiculous to think that would be the case at Amazon, why is it any less ridiculous to think that our work is the same way? As risk management professionals and as audit professionals, we are creating new source information every day. as we write things down in documents and spreadsheets and create original work, that's original, call it even almost transactional data or data that can be the source of insights if it's not trapped in a place where it's very difficult to report on. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. As Jonathan already introduced, thanks very much, Jonathan. My name is Dan Zitting. I'm the Chief Product Officer at ACL. But my background, like those of you on the call today, is in risk management and internal audit services in particular. And I ended up in the software business because I had this foundational problem. After I left my career at the Big Four, one of the Big Four firms, a business partner and I started our own practice, and questions just like those I shared at the beginning began to get painful once our team got up to a certain size. And I thought, you know what, there has to be a better way to manage this that isn't going to cost me the amount of staff time it does every month or every week or whatever the case may be to compile these answers and report them back to clients. So reflecting on that set of issues, I like to think of, having identified the fundamental problem here as what I like to refer to as dark data. So what does dark data mean? Not an term that I made up or that ACL made up, but a recognized term in the IT industry at this point. This is Gartner's definition of dark data, where they talk about dark data as being the information assets that organizations collect, process, and store during regular business activities, i.e. risk management processes, risk assessments, internal audits, etc., but generally fail to use for other purposes, i.e. for analytics, business relationships, direct monetizing, etc. Similar to dark matter in physics, dark data often companies make up the most of an organization's universe of information assets. And I think that's especially true in risk management and internal audit. Our dark data retained in spreadsheets and documents after its first primary use it does make up the majority of our information assets that we have as functions. But they're often retained only for compliance purposes. We can't use them to do analytics against and to build queries to answer questions like those I shared earlier. So thinking about dark data, here's the couple of things that I hope we can accomplish today. I just want to exchange and share with you some shared experience on whether working in documents really is materially damaging our value and relevance as audit and risk professionals. And I should mention this today, I believe we're about 2/3 internal audit folks and about 1/3 risk management professionals and teams, all primarily from financial services organizations on the call today. So I'll do my best to speak to both audiences. Next, we'll describe what I've termed the 7 dangers of document-based risk management and internal audit, and try to illustrate those and give some hopefully help you give some consideration for whether they really are problems for your organization or not, and then explore how we might consider change. And most importantly, of course, what I'm the most qualified to speak on is what that means technologically, and illustrate a technology-related maturity model to see how do we evolve out of these common dark data problems. So I'm going to share, this is a lot of words on the screen, but I'm going to share what I would call a position statement, just to lay the groundwork for what I'm going to discuss as we go through the discussion today. So my position fundamentally would be is what I would call primary documentation, and I'll define a bit more about what that means later on. It should be captured directly into a technology platform where it can, to the very largest extent possible, be queried. Being able to be queried is really the key. Being able to query information makes reporting, exporting, analyzing, sharing, remotely accessing, and I would also say reusing our core information assets seamlessly. Moving on from primary documentation, I would argue that documents, and in particular, metadata embedded in documents especially, and I'll talk about what that means a bit later on, cannot be queried, at least not easily, and therefore should be used exclusively for secondary evidence, or that kind of material gathered in the field that just serves as evidence of conclusions we've made. Organizations should never be dependent on document embedded metadata for any of core audit work, core quality assurance processes, risk assessment, risk analysis, and the insights and reporting to stakeholders. So using that as a bit of a backdrop, let's jump right into walking through some of these dangers and what I would call out as the summary items of why operating internal audit or risk management processes out of primarily documents and spreadsheets creates this black hole for information, insight, and knowledge. The first danger, and most important, queryability. You'll hear me repeat this phrase a lot. Documents are not databases, and thus information inside the documents or spreadsheets is dark data. When I say documents aren't queryable, of course, there's the first piece of that is just can be very difficult to search and search effectively. Sure, there are mechanisms to search drives full of files, and I can search my email where all those attachments lie to some degree, but it's difficult, and Google style search of that information doesn't work very well. More importantly, structured asks of that data. Show me all risks within a particular business entity, or show me all issues belonging to a particular executive owner. Those kinds of structured queries become very, very difficult in documents and spreadsheets. And I'll just share some examples of as I move through today. Of course, when working in a technology platform where information is structured and queryable, just as a very simple example, here's a risk monitoring project primarily around our IT applications, just as demo data that I'll look at a couple of times today. But let's say I want to know everything about terminated user access. If I type in the search term termination, I can find controls, information on the control design, testing, all around those that matter of terminating users. That kind of a query can be quite difficult when all of our structured information is buried across a series of spreadsheets. So the second piece is relatability. So again, documents not being databases, the information inside of documents and spreadsheets cannot inherently maintain relationships between it and other information. So this relatability is what makes queryability on those structured queries I mentioned, like issues per executive owner a minute ago, possible, because we have established relationships between different relevant types of information asset. So what I mean by that is, of course, this would be the more common. This is the type of spreadsheet that I operated out of for a good portion of my career. In this case, this is an example where we have, relating to the same example that I just shared, we have key processes, and within these processes, each of the relevant risks, the assessment of those risks within the processes, and the related controls that mitigate and manage those risks. Obviously, on each row in the spreadsheet here, I've tried to create a relationship between risks and controls as an example. However, if I change that relationship here in this spreadsheet, or I change this control description in the spreadsheet, it won't flow through necessarily to all of my other spreadsheets. The relationship breaks and the queryability falls down. Of course, when you move into an environment more like a more structured environment, this is the sort of problem that is eliminated by creating direct associations, in this case, between this risk of potential poor user access to the controls in place that manage it. Those relationships are now established, and I can create reporting and queryability on those. And should I update them, updates everywhere else within my processes. Now I'll move along through a couple of these others a little more quickly. So again, documents not being databases, they don't protect data integrity well, and do not log and track key events or changes or destruction of information within those documents. So while we try to do the best we can to version control documents, think of seeing the typical shared drive full of documents with the V1, V2, V3, it's hard to tell what actually changed within those, who changed them, and what might have gone on that we need to know about. Of course, in the case of a more granular, in the case of when using technology, each of these, as an example, each update to a control, each update to testing, each update to a risk assessment maintains a whole history and audit log where I can tell what was destroyed. I can go back in time and understand or really keep track of the reliability of my data. Accessibility. So as risk management projects, risk management processes, audit processes and projects are completed and compiled in these spreadsheets, it can be very hard to access those from outside the environment. So, for example, going in and updating a risk assessment or allowing process owners to provide their risk ratings from a mobile device, for example, can be very difficult. Similarly, it's very difficult to export and archive the appropriate data dumps based on perhaps your needs for around IT data retention, that sort of thing. Because it's hard to know where all of the key information is, it takes time to compile such an export or archive. Danger number 6. Here I'd like to talk about sustainability. So what I commonly see happen is consistency when you're managing entirely out of documents and spreadsheets and teams get a little bit larger, consistency tends to suffer. So a common example in audit might be, I have 3 different audit managers that come from 3 different backgrounds. They all have their own tastes and preferences about how they build and develop these documents. So as a chief audit executive, I might see when it comes time to review work papers, I see a completely different structure of documents between each one of those managers. In a risk setting, I may see different risk managers or different areas of the business building their risk assessment off of inconsistent, either inconsistent risk assessment scales, or perhaps using different criteria as to what makes up a medium versus a high rating in a particular risk context. That sort of inconsistency begins to create a very difficult place to compile information from, consistently report, and make it so that things like risk ratings roll up effectively. Also, from a sustainability standpoint, depending on the type of technology in place, from an IT sustainability standpoint, oftentimes software that's provided, software programs or software platforms that are used to help manage the complexity and help manage and relate these documents together have deep system dependencies on, for example, the version of Microsoft Office. Perhaps they have thick clients, these sorts of things that can create software dependencies that create conflicts and difficult upgrades. If I have to upgrade my version of Office, but this technology platform isn't yet set up for integration with the new version of Office, I can create disruptions to my risk management program, my audit program, as well as potential data integrity issues as well. And then finally, simply usability. As systems of spreadsheets become more complex, or as complex document management systems, things like SharePoint or legacy applications are implemented to manage all of these documents, the dependencies just get larger and larger, and usability and training becomes a bigger and bigger issue, in particular as the team grows. So across those summary dangers, I hope those give perhaps capture some of the pains that you might see or endure when primarily working out of documents and spreadsheets. Now, most of the folks on the call today are in fact from financial services organizations. Now, I think this is where really the dangers are amplified. And of course, I don't need to be the one to tell you that in highly scrutinized regulatory environments, these issues of consistency, searchability, reportability, in particular of risk management activities, but also audit work as well, only increase risk because there is just such a high level of scrutiny from the regulators, and so many more eyeballs on that work from an examination perspective that relatively unsophisticated regulatory reviewers effectively can't self-serve from this kind of information. And for those kinds of risk purposes, each of their requests or examinations require that manual compilation of exactly that information they require. Whereas, and of course, that process being prone to error, that will lead to an auditor or an examiner finding issue. In fact, as an interesting example, right before, literally minutes before we got on the call today, I saw in a separate discussion this news article come across my feed, which talks about basically an organization where they ran into material, in this case, financial audit implications with their financial auditor based on this quote unquote spreadsheet hell and the errors that had occurred, causing a material error in their forecasts that ultimately led to some, as you can see, some real trouble for the business. Those are the types of dangers, particularly in financial services organizations, we're trying to navigate around. So I want to go back to our actual digital work products. So our risk assessments, our audit projects, all of those things we prepare day to day as risk and audit professionals, and revisit my original primary point around primary versus secondary documentation. I would argue that from a core methodology standpoint, the critical documentation and the information assets we create fall into two broad categories. The first is primary documentation. Primary documentation, what I mean by that is this is the risk or audit or compliance professional's primary information captured that articulates the procedures they performed, why they were done, what the results were, conclusions reached, etc. This is information that's the original thought of the risk professional, so to speak, or that might end up, that information that might end up in a report or otherwise shared as results to board audiences, management audiences, etc. The other type of documentation is that secondary or supporting evidence. Of course, as risk professionals, when we are making evaluations, we interact with the business or with the operations of our government entities to obtain artifacts throughout our processes that directly evidence what led to the professional conclusions documented above. That, of course, is often acquired in files, spreadsheets, documents, etc., which I think is great. But what I think we want to be careful of is making sure that that first category of evidence is truly what lives in the quote unquote system, regardless of what system technologically you use. Primary audit documentation being documented into form fields driven by an underlying database that maintains the relationships between that information ensures that all of the work you do is reportable and queryable in a way where you can extract the most value from that work and from the work that your teams below you have accomplished. As it relates to the secondary or supporting evidence, particularly in audits, but in the risk functions and compliance functions as well, the key there is that while this may come in files, and that's fine, that evidence needs to be fully preserved. And what I mean by that is we consistently see certain technology platforms that allow you to take audit evidence or take evidence from the field, supporting documents, and mark them up with all kinds of embedded metadata information that documents your work. That metadata is now work done by the risk professional that has effectively become dark data. In addition to that, if you think of court evidence as a corollary, we would never pick up the bloody knife at the crime scene, so to speak, and begin to mark all over it what we see and what we find in the forensics of that particular situation. So why do we take original evidence and original artifacts that support conclusions of what we've assessed, what we've examined, what we've audited in the business, and effectively modify them with our own work? An appropriate technology platform can help make sure to avoid this and make sure that whether it's regulatory scrutiny that involves those artifacts, or more importantly, should one of your projects, one of your audits, etc., ever end up subpoenaed in a legal environment, that the integrity of those artifacts and assets is maintained. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's clear. The idea and the distinction between using that discipline and our review and quality assurance procedures to say, how do we make sure that primary information goes into a system of record, and then separately, how do we maintain in files artifacts and evidence we receive, but do so without ever either adding additional metadata into those files that becomes dark data, or damaging those files in the event that we need them in the future. All right, so I hope that at this stage, and probably if you're on the call, I didn't need to, I hope we've convinced you of some of the common challenges, or what may be even just the nagging pains of this dark data that comes from working primarily in documents and spreadsheets. So now I want to talk about making a shift to get out of that environment. And it would only be appropriate to say that's a combination of people, process, and technology. I suppose that's what we always say from a methodology standpoint to any kind of change management in our profession. But of course, it really does hold true. So the first aspect of that is people. And I think this does, of course, as always, come down to tone from the top of your risk organization, audit organization, to say, hey, as a team, let's recognize these challenges that we have and agree that we're undertaking a transformative step. It will transform our ability to deliver insight, to be agile and flexible, and respond at the speed of the organization. And the way that we do that is recognizing this need to structurally move that primary documentation and our primary work into a set of processes and technology that capture it in a way where we can draw more value more quickly from it when we go into the phase of reporting with our stakeholders. From a process standpoint, I think that means incorporating the procedures into our core methodology to ensure all professionals understand those two categories of digital documentation, understand the work products and the outcomes that we're trying to deliver, and then finally have a QA process that is aligned to reviewing for the same. So while we're going through this change management process, how do we make sure that we have a process that drives the right behaviors, as well as a QA to make sure that transforming out of randomly structured documents to highly structured digital information assets go smoothly. And then of course, all of that is enabled by technology. So with virtually any sort of size team at this point, it's inevitably important to take advantage of technology to what's really ultimately, to be honest with ourselves, is protect people from themselves. We do that by enforcing a workflow that discourages that primary information from being documented into dark files, and disables and makes sure that it systematically prevents key metadata or key work from being embedded into files and turning into dark data, turning into where relationships to other information may be broken, etc. So the technology piece there is the piece that I found well before I ever worked at ACL transform my ability to make this shift. And so if you think just thinking a little bit very quickly about the evolution of audit and risk management technology, what's the evolution that made my shift possible? And then think about that relative to where each of our organizations sits today. Very quickly, of course, we all started, of course, except for those that are younger than me, started in what were really hard copy files, particularly on the audit side, but certainly on the risk side as well. We captured and prepared binders of materials that served as evidence. Obviously, served as evidence of our work and our primary documentation. Obviously, this is the ultimate in non-queryable dark data. But beginning really, I would say, en masse in the mid 90s, even the early 90s perhaps, but certainly by the mid 90s, we began to create what looks like this, and where many of us operate today, which is the big set of folders within a shared drive that have all of our different files and documents shared here. This, of course, big improvement, at least now I can use the Windows search bar up there on the top right. So big improvement over the hard copies, but still there is inherently no true way to create those relationships and create those structured queries. And that's where a series of technology platforms, what I would frankly classify as the more legacy audit platforms, risk platforms, even your more generic document management platforms that you'd get from IT, like a SharePoint, began to take steps to say, we'll provide enterprise applications installed on a server on-premise in the company's data center with a thick client or an application you install on your laptop to access that server, where we'll be able to manage those documents better. This is where the integration came in with those documents to make linking things between documents possible through embedded metadata, those sorts of things. This kind of application is a material step forward indeed, but I would argue has since been surpassed by, in particular, true cloud software as a service applications, but at a minimum by what are web-based, web interface applications that ensure or that put workflow around making sure that the right information is captured in forms, goes into the database, and does not get embedded into documents. The true cloud side of that then makes all of that information accessible across devices. So of course, makes it easier to access when you're on the road, more accessible from everywhere, et cetera, but also makes it accessible on mobile devices, which is very important in today's world, of course. But perhaps the one we sometimes consider, we don't take time to adequately consider, is more importantly, makes it structured and available to reporting and analytics tools, so that we can look at all of the information we've captured without having to go in directly to the database and make analytical analysis and key reports from that information, while also reducing our IT risks. So getting rid of the required upgrades, the installations on premise, and the security issues that come with that, etc. We're now moving into the fifth stage, I would argue. And the fifth stage is, now that we have structured information coming out of our audit processes, our risk management processes, there are really powerful tools to use that data to create automation. And I like to think of this as kind of the age of robotic data automation, so to speak. So with all of that data captured in centralized places, today, for example, when I prepare my report to the audit committee, or when I prepare reports monthly, information packages to perhaps the risk governance committee, those have to be manually compiled from across different information sources into one report of the required format for our organization. This kind of automation can create effectively what I like to think of as little mini robots that automatically compile those kinds of reports across data sources, just as one example of turning mundane tasks into true automation, so that you can add these mini robots to your team and extend your impact while not having to take on the additional, we all live under the constraint of wanting additional resources. This kind of automation is the way to do it without having to ask for additional people. So if I were to think of that evolution of technology, I think it's still highly representative of really where organizations sit today, starting from level one down here in the manual documentation up into the Office documents and shared drives at level 2, all the way up into that systematized data that enables that robotic data automation at level 5. That, I think, plots well against the axes of how much business value can we derive from the information assets that we're capturing in our day-to-day work, up here on the y-axis, and then increasingly across the x-axis, how much automation and efficiency can we drive into our work? How many tasks that I have to manually complete today can I make more efficient or even fully automate, going from left to right? And of course, through these levels, I would argue that far too many of us are still stuck somewhere here on that grid. Primarily using Office documents and shared drives, perhaps getting into the shared point, but really the queryability, the lacking queryability of that information, limiting the business value we can derive from it, as well as creating lots of manual work that's impossible to automate or drive efficiency from at this stage. And of course, where I would argue is that leading organizations in 2018, hopefully most of us want to push towards and create a roadmap towards that level 4. That's a reasonable sort of process and technology implementation to make, a reasonable people change to occur moving up into level 4. We can all do that with a relatively straightforward project to accomplish it. I would argue that leaders in 2018 have reached that stage and are pushing into this robotic data automation. Now that we have that, how can I completely automate? For example, using the data that's available to fully automate my risk assessment through fully automated KRIs, for example. That kind of robotic automation is really leading risk management departments in particular, but certainly leading audit departments as well into the next stage of value and to the business and efficiency and automation for the department. So I hope that's a useful model to think about, and where do I sit from a technology perspective today, and where do I want to look to mature to over the next little bit. As we accomplish that, I would argue that these are the most common, from a risk and audit perspective. I'll talk about the IT perspective in a minute, but I would argue from a risk and audit perspective, these are the most common benefits we immediately see. So certainly the improved productivity of the fieldwork efforts. This gets down to what I was talking about in the system before, just the sheer efficiency in saying we have as a risk management function, we have a standardized process that we all follow. And as you make updates along the way, it keeps everything in sync. So from policy management through risk analysis to perhaps assigning controls and control monitoring, et cetera. Similarly, from an audit perspective, it may look a little bit different. Perhaps I have a process of documenting process narratives, creating risk control matrices, doing walkthroughs, tests, and testing. Regardless that process, the appropriate technology platform can be set up to enable that and drive a workflow that just really helps gain that efficiency and productivity in our on-the-ground work. And our on-the-ground work is where the majority of time is spent. That same fundamental workflow, though, provides a much higher consistency of approach and quality between projects, between processes, and between audits. The reports coming out of a workflow like that will look the same every time. Now, this is where we get into the good stuff. We're elevating the quality of risk and audit insights. So just as a dead simple example of this, let me see why I can't see. There we go. Can't see my pointer. Just as a very simple, very simple example of this, I may have questions come in around what are my how effective currently are my key processes? What's the risk and control status within each one? I can quickly create scorecards like this one. This happens to be our same IT risk monitoring, where I can say, hey, here's my key IT processes. Overall, how effective is that process? Red light, green light, yellow light, and how many controls have failed, how many have passed, what are the issues identified, etc. Maybe the same on the audit side. There's an example over here from SOX. Could be the same on the third-party risk management side. This is for vendor management, etc. That kind of a report can be created very, very quickly because all of the information is structured and ready to go, and I can provide these insights in real time, on a monthly basis, whatever the case may be. Taking that a step further to say, how do we elevate our insights even better? One simple example, this that we call our process risk visualizer. This lets me take all of my different risk analysis across the organization, across processes, et cetera, and look at it as it relates to how much risk via our assessments. I can look at it by IT application, by asset, by operating unit, et cetera. And now I can make it highly interactive. So let me drill through and look at risk by application. So as an IT professional, as the CIO, I'm interested in how my risk assessments fall out relative to my core business applications. Here I can see substantial amount of risk as it relates to my Oracle application in this drill through. I can also get an idea through the core processes, vendor management, cybersecurity, et cetera, what led to that risk, or of course, even drill down into that individual application to be able to see what specific assessments, what specific processes led to identifying that risk. So now I have the full details of granular risk assessment over time as it relates to my Oracle enterprise application in this particular example. Now, I don't expect that to be clear or understood at this point. That's not meant to be a technology demo, but it's just meant to say, because information is structured, all of those reporting and analytics are available just to elevate that insight and make it quicker to, in turn, of course, also quicker to achieve. So any of those types of reports or analytics can be created with a relatively straightforward approach and can share reports between functions where you're building alignment between departments. Now, the other piece of what makes insight from risk and audit impactful is the ability to present it really well, or to make it high impact in presentation. Now, again, this is where inefficiency comes into play, because even if our spreadsheets are linked in a way where key information flows between spreadsheets and that sort of thing, when it comes time to present to the risk governance committee or present to the board, I, of course, usually am going through a process of manually compiling information into a high impact presentation, PowerPoint, or perhaps a long form report. In the case of structured technology like this, these kinds of reports can be produced automatically. So in this case, you see in my organization here, Pied Piper, I have a series of reports that have been pre-populated, and they are already done in my chosen Word, or my chosen or my preferred Word or PowerPoint templates. And so with a click of a button, it produces those forms of reports. So in this case, here's an example from this same kind of IT risk management, where this is the format is completely arbitrary. Have my organization's brand, my governance committee's objective and scope, etc. But it's all been compiled into a totally editable, manually editable, long form Word report in this case, right out of what was captured in the system as we went through doing our work. So absolutely no manual compilation of something like going back through and compiling the issues, building charts and graphs like this, compiling, hey, by process, how effective are we, that kind of scorecard view, or getting a list of the outstanding issues and the details on each of those issues, all available right here in this long form report and completely automated. Similar to that, you could do the same thing in Excel data dumps, or even in a PowerPoint presentation. So fully automated generation of that same kind of information into a PowerPoint presentation report that really lifts the burden of my manual compilation of quarterly risk reporting for my governance committee or my board. I'll just wrap up here on the last couple of points and take a couple of questions. But the last couple of key benefits that I'd consider is just think about having the easier ability to also, with structured content like this, roll forward and reuse it. Where I roll forward an audit, or perhaps reuse risk assessments from one IT in one entity to the next. It's a manual process of cleansing documents and figuring out what's needed and what's not to reuse that content. This structured content can be rolled forward and reused using the technology to do the work for you. And then generally, of course, leading into the enhanced automation and, more importantly, that opportunity to begin to move into level 5, where we build actual robotic automation based on that core data. Now, it's not just from a business perspective or an audit and risk perspective that there's benefit. Surely there is IT benefit from an IT perspective in moving into this kind of a environment from a technology maturity standpoint. Making data available on any device. We've talked about eliminating data integrity risks. Again, ensuring that exportability and transferability of structured data. Eliminating the need for PC installations and upgrades, or even in-house server installations and upgrades, and overall an enhanced level of performance. So as you reflect on where you might want to take this in your own organization, maybe just consider some of the other functions in your organization as a benchmark. Certainly in my case, I work for a software company. Our big functions outside of audit, assurance and risk management related functions are, of course, product and research development. In our case, even in a mid-sized company like us, the idea of running R&D off of a bunch of documents and spreadsheets would likely get the CTO fired. And if not get the CTO fired, if all of our engineers couldn't work in a platform, in our case, this is Atlassian's Jira product, if we weren't able to work as a product development organization in an agile, organized platform, I imagine we wouldn't have many engineers working here very quickly. I'm not sure why audit and risk professionals put up with anything different. Similarly, our other big functions, of course, are our marketing and sales functions. There are no functions I'm aware of in organizations that en masse are more automated and more well organized with technology from the marketing and sales. You can imagine trying to do sales reporting off of every individual sales rep having their own spreadsheet. In any kind of mature organization, certainly a chief marketing officer, a chief sales officer, chief revenue officer would be in real trouble with their CEO. And I think as risk and audit professionals, we should hold ourselves to the same kind of accountability and real-time automation and reporting. So I'll leave this resource as a leave behind. There is, as mentioned, everybody will be receiving these slides, but the biggest question we get is, that's all great, but how do I build the business case for doing this? We have some great studies. They're done by Forrester, not by ACL, the Forrester analyst research firm. They're called total economic impact studies, and they use Forrester's model for, in our case, specifically for risk technology and audit technology. How do you go about quantifying a 3-year net present value, reductions in efficiency and time, reductions in regulatory issues, annualized ROI, what was avoided in hiring costs and consulting fees, to put together a real quantified economic case for building the technology. And those are available at the link down here below. These ones illustrate them as case studies for some of our customers, but the point is the model may work very well for you in helping build a business case to make the investments necessary to take those processes and technology to the next maturity level. So with that, thank you from myself and ACL. For those on the call that don't know ACL well, of course, we are a global community of over 7,000 customers. Many of those, over 800, are financial institutions, some of the examples you see here on the right, and really no better place without it sounding like a shill sales pitch, no better place to get access to a community that can really, of your peers, that can really help be a peer community for bouncing these kinds of ideas and measuring and benchmarking these kinds of challenges against each other. So with that, I'm just going to flip over and see if we have a couple of questions. Bear with me here just a moment. And as mentioned, we'll answer any of the questions. That we don't get to here separately. let's see, this first question, we have a GRC platform from the majority of our risk assessments, but there are some we do via spreadsheet, threat assessments, IT threat assessments, etc. My question is this: we have some resources, spreadsheets that various regulators have provided to us. How would we approach that issue in regards to dark data, since it was provided directly from the regulator? Great, that's a fantastic question. In those cases, there are ways to build form-based assessments that mimic the data in those spreadsheets. So that's one way to do it, is to take those assessments as forms, form submissions, and then that way all of the data is captured centrally and then report out into the regulator's required spreadsheet. The other way to do it may be to go the reverse direction if you're absolutely forced into it, which is to say you may fill out the spreadsheet for the regulator and then use data tools to extract that data back out into the general system so that you can use that system for other types of reporting and insight. Be glad to dig into that one separately in more detail. Thanks very much for the question. Another couple of questions here. Let's see. What size companies does the business case data apply to? Do you have data for Fortune 50 companies? Seems like the value would be much higher. Yeah, you know, arguably it oftentimes is, can be more complex to evaluate in the very large, in the Fortune 50, Fortune 100 type companies. I think the model that I shared there, the Forrester model, applies very well, whether you're more of a mid-cap organization or very large. It just may be a much higher volume of data inputs that you might want in the larger organizations. Tend to be obviously the dollar impact higher in large organizations, but the ROI can be off the chart even in a mid-cap. In a mid-cap organization. Some of the examples that were at that link that I shared are, for example, 700% ROI annually in a government or in a state government. For example, one is a relatively small, just a well sub $10 billion bank that was over 350% ROI. And then up to and including, of course, as you mentioned, the very large companies. Getting right down to the end of our time, so I'll just do one more question here. This all sounds great. Where do I go from here? How do I get started? So of course, as ACL, we'd be glad to connect with you and do a bit of a high level assessment of you know, where do you sit on that maturity curve and where are some of the biggest opportunities. But regardless, that's where I would start, is trying to be honest with myself about where I sit departmentally and not just in perhaps narrow pockets of my team. Where do I sit departmentally on that maturity curve, and what do I have a vision and appetite to get to? What's my capacity to drive change, and ultimately will you know, board level stakeholders, management level stakeholders, what would they derive value from? Is it the insight and depth of reporting, because that may mean, you know, the real target is level 4, or is it driving out automation and efficiency, roboticizing a lot of compliance and risk assessment, et cetera, up in that level 5 category, reducing cost and increasing capacity to hold regulatory burden. Maybe level 5 is the target. So that's where I would start, is with that maturity curve, and then thinking about where's my near-term vision and longer-term vision to get. With that, it is the top of the hour. Thank you, everybody, so much. We'll answer the other questions offline, and I hope you have a great afternoon. We appreciate and look forward to your feedback. Thanks so much.